关于这个国际，去哪儿啊？
没事没事，不用管。
啊，我们这个第二部分是关于国际贸易的这个历史。So it's basically an overview of history. And it's a broad overview, so there's not much that's very specific in here. The purpose is just to get you thinking about long-term processes and large-scale processes that tend to influence trade. Because in many ways, trade is something that shapes all of you every day. All of the objects that you get are made usually somewhere else, and they get here through some sort of trade. So trade history is shaped in general by three main factors. The first one is inventions, like the ones that we're going to talk about, like clocks that can work at sea, for example, like the boat, like the airplane, etc. The second one is routes and explorers. So all of the explorers, including Da Gama, including Zhenghe, including all of the explorers that opened up new routes. And the third factor that shapes trade is empires or countries or trade cities or ports. So in the very early history of trade, the transformation was huge. So first, when people started using the horse, I don't know if have you ever been on a horse or no? Have you ever been on a horse or no? Yes, no, maybe. No? So on a horse, usually you can put about 20% of the weight of the horse. So if the horse is around 500 kilograms, you can put about 100 kilograms on the horse. And that's not very efficient. So a horse can go around 30 miles per day. And usually you can put around 90 kilos or 200 pounds on a horse. So when people invented the wheel, that was a revolution. Because with the wheel, one horse can pull around 4,000 pounds or almost 2 tons with the exact same strength. So that's an increase in production of around 20 times. So the wheel was a huge invention. And then the next genius invention was obviously the boat. So even the rafts that people used, the very, very simple rafts, the ancient ones, which are basically just wood struck together, they could carry about as much as a cart with wheels. So they could still carry around 2 tons. And obviously, if you're going down a river, you don't need any external power, you don't need horses and things like that. So the raft was a genius invention, and so was the boat. And the very early European boats were basically made of wood and leather. And what they would do, for instance, when they traded things like wine between Greece and Armenia, is they would make boats of leather and wood, and then they would put the wine on the boat, and then they would also put horses on the boat. So once they get to the destination and they get off, they take the horses out, and then they take the boats apart, and then they put them on the horses, and they go back on land. So essentially they were using the water just as long as the flow, as long as the current was in their direction, and then they would go back on a horse. But the interesting thing is that these inventions, the wheel and the boat, they didn't completely make horses and camels obsolete. And especially in places like the Middle East, the camel remained very, very relevant. So even if you go there today, for instance, when I was at the border between India and Pakistan, they still keep camels for trade and for the army as well. So there are places where you have to go through, and it's very, very rough desert. And the only animal that goes through is the camel. So you can't go there with wheels, you can't go there with any kind of cars efficiently, you can only go there with the camel. And that's actually, there's a very interesting book. It's called The Camel and the Wheel, I believe. That was published about 40 or so years ago, but it's still a very interesting account. And it explains why people still kept using camels in the Middle East. And one of the theories about the fact that the region is underdeveloped economically is that they never started using wheels and technology as actively. They obviously used them, but not as much. So the camel remained a much more popular method of transport there. So the other big invention that was a fundamental transformation was the clock. So I have no idea if you ever thought about it, but before clocks, navigating on sea was a nightmare. So generally, as long as you can't see the shore anymore, first of all, it's very hard to know in which direction you're going. Second of all, it's very hard to know how far exactly you've gone. So they tried to measure speed, and their way of measuring speed was essentially they had a long rope, and they had knots, and the knots were tied exactly 47 feet and 3 inches apart, so exactly 14.4 meters apart. And what they would do is they would time usually 28 seconds, or let's take it 30 seconds to make it easier. And what they would do is they would just put a timer on and then start letting the rope go and measure how many knots went out in the sea. So as the boat was moving, they would just let the rope go for 30 seconds, and when you hit 30 seconds, they would stop. And they would count how many knots of the rope went into the water. And essentially, that's what's known as the log line. So the rope was usually connected to something that would then float into the water, and then the rope would go down in the water, and then you would count the knots. So it might be 1, 2, 3, 4 knots. And then you know that this is the distance you went in 30 seconds, or however many seconds you timed. And that's how they timed speed. They literally measured time and distance. And that was obviously not accurate, and it was a lot of trouble to do it. So the big invention that changed that was the clock. And the clock turned into something like the modern GPS, essentially. So what they did is, in London, they usually set the clock to exactly 12 o'clock at noon when the sun was right up there. And then they started sailing. For instance, imagine that you're sailing towards the US. You start sailing, and when you see that you've hit 6 o'clock and the sun is right above you, then you know that you've gone 1/4 of the Earth. So let me try and explain that. Let me try and explain that for you a bit more clearly. So if you have the map of the world and you have England right here, you set it at 12 o'clock, and you know that the sun is right up there when you start sailing. You start sailing here, and then you see the sun again right up there, but the clock is showing 6 o'clock. So the clock has gone from 12 to 6. So that's 1/4 of the day, 1/4 of 24 hours. And that means you've gone exactly 1/4 of the world. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the clock was an invention that changed, the clock that could be used at sea was an invention that changed absolutely everything. And it wasn't easy to build a clock that would work on sea. So they called it, the first one, the precision pendulum clock number 2. And it was built by the Harrison brothers, and we know that because one of the brothers signed the clock, and that's actually the one that did the design for it. And it was when they made it, it was the most accurate clock on planet Earth in that moment. It used to go off only 1 second a month. So each month it would go 1 second off. But that was extremely accurate for the time. And the way that they used it was, just as I explained, they would use the clock to measure the time, and then they would use something called a sextant to measure the height of the sun. So that's an instrument that you use to measure the height of the sun at sea specifically. So essentially the first GPS was a clock in the modern sense of the world. Now, apart from inventions, you had early explorers that opened new routes that were immensely important for international trade. And one of the key ports back in the day was Alexandria. So if you look at the world, and that's the world around the Middle Ages, the port of Alexandria is right here. It's in modern day Egypt. Whoops, let me go back. It's in modern day Egypt. And when the Europeans used to trade with the Arab Empire, the Arab world was almost like a completely locked place for them. So the only place that they could go to was Alexandria. They would stop their ships here, they would negotiate, they would take the goods, and then go back to Europe. So for centuries, the Arab world remained an absolute mystery for Europeans. And it was almost something similar to Guangzhou, if you've thought of Chinese history, where foreigners, obviously hundreds of years ago, used to come here, stop at the port of Guangzhou, get their goods, and go back. So it was similar when they traded with China at some point. They didn't know much about the inside of China. They used to go to Guangzhou and back. So what started to change in terms of the Arab world in Europe, and the reason the Arab world is important is because it's between Europe and Asia. So once you unlock the Arab world, then you can go into Asia. So the Arab world started to change in the 13th century, where when at the beginning the Mongols, which were at the time a rising empire, although a short-lived one, pushed through the barrier, and they just broke the essentially big barrier shield that was covering the Arab world. And after that, what happened is someone you perhaps know quite a bit about, Marco Polo, who went in the direction of Asia, all the way to China, Japan, etc. And he came back to Europe after around 20 years, and he wrote a book that became essentially a bestseller back in the day, entitled Description of the World, at least the way that he thought about it. So he put the title Description of the World, but the readers at the time started calling it Il Milione, which meant the million, or a million. And the reason for that is that people thought the book had a million lies in it. People didn't believe the book. But even though they didn't believe the book, they still started dreaming about Asia, and they also knew that there was a way to Asia. So the Marco Polo's essentially discovery of things in Asia was fundamental to sparking the imagination of the Europeans. From that point on, they knew there was something, and also they knew great stories about it. They knew stories about great riches that he saw in Asia as well. So after Marco Polo, another important person in the history of opening routes was Prince Henry the Navigator. So he came from a Portuguese family that was it used to be rich, but it was in decline at the time, and they were struggling to keep their royal status. So he needed to do something about it, and one thing he did was he found exploration as a source of income. So Prince Henry the Navigator, he wasn't much of an explorer himself, but he used to fund explorations abroad. And in 1441, one of the explorations he funded came back with a lot of gold from a city in northern Africa. So that also connects to the story about the Muslims, because if you think about it, especially in that part of the world, Europeans heard a lot of stories about gold here, because when they went down to Alexandria and to these parts of the Muslim world, they saw the gold, and it must be coming from somewhere. So they knew there was gold, but they didn't know exactly where it was. And one of Prince Henry's missions got some of the gold from one of the towns here and brought it back. So from this point on, he knew, and other people knew, that there was lots of riches there. And in 1443, another one of his expeditions came back with gold and slaves, which back in the day, obviously, people used to do slave trade. And that was also a big deal for the time. So Prince Henry the Navigator essentially sparked more of the imagination of Europeans. And what's interesting is that a little bit later, you had two more voyagers, and they make very interesting parallels. So one of them is obviously John He, and the other one is Vasco da Gama. and they sailed roughly at the same time. So one of them came from, obviously, a very rich and huge China. The other one came from the small Portugal, which was in some ways struggling economically. So even people like Prince Henry the Navigator, even some of the royals were struggling at the time. So when Zheng He sailed all around Africa, and he made 7 great voyages, and there are many stories about how big his ships were, although some historians dispute that. What he found was essentially things that were not of that much of an interest to China. Well, for the simple reason that China was very rich at the time. So there wasn't much that he would find to start with. Whereas Vasco da Gama was much more motivated, and once he found a way through Good Hope, through the south of Africa, over to India, he was basically doing his absolute best to get into Asia. And he went to the town of Goa in India, and he took it over, and it was very violent, and he was trying to get into Asia because he came from a place which was obviously not in as good of a situation. Now, the very telling part is that after Vasco da Gama came back, the Portuguese became very motivated to go back to Asia, and they started colonizing places like areas of India. Whereas when Zheng He went back, the emperor that came after his death decided that these explorations were not very fruitful. So he decided to reinvest the money in other things, like, for instance, the Great Wall that we have right now. So these routes opened up trade, and places like Venice, for instance, benefited a lot in Europe, that were well connected. And you can see even still today, if you go there, that they used to be rich, and it's very obvious. So after that kind of wave of exploration and opening, one of the other things that changes was the types of ships that people used. So the early ships that they used relied largely on the winds. And what's very interesting, especially about the Indian Ocean, is that if you look at the map here, the winds change. So from November to February, you have a monsoon that's blowing that way, and then from April to September, it's blowing the other way. So that was very beneficial to people that used to do trade here. But it was still limiting because they had to wait for the right time. And then when the steamship came, it was a huge driver of globalization, and it drove the British Empire up tremendously. So if you go to museums in the UK up until today, if you go to places like Liverpool, you see these big ships that are put on display, and they're always called SS something, because SS stands for steamship. So there was an unprecedented increase in world trade back then. There are estimates that around half of the trade growth came from the invention of the steamship. And then after World War II, you saw a change in the ships that we use as well. So now we use a lot of diesel-based engines, although not all of the ships use diesel-based engines. Some of them use different types of oil that are not as clean. But anyway, that's another type of fundamental change that brings us to today. So today, if you want to ship things, you have 4 options. The first one is the ocean, where you have the diesel-powered ships, and it's cheapest, slowest, but usually used for bulk products. The second option is rail, which is cheaper than the road option. For longer journeys, it is moderately fast, it is relatively eco-friendly, but there are some additional complications. So if you're shipping through rail, for example, I don't know if you've thought about it, but the rail standards for every country are different. So the rails are wider in some places and narrower at others. So every time you get to a border, then they have to basically adjust to the tracks for the rail. And you also run into other complications, like for instance, when we shipped a couple of containers earlier in the year, we ran into issues when we passed through Moscow and the customs there. So rail is still an option that's in development, and it's kind of in the middle between ocean transport and road and air transport. The third option is road, cost effective and fast for short trips. So especially if you go to places like Europe, you see a lot of trucks going back and forth all the time because you have many small countries put together. And you see obviously a lot less of these when you go to China, because you have rail networks that connect distant places. With road, the good thing is you get door-to-door delivery, and you can track and trace every single truck that's on the road at any time. Air is most expensive, but it's fastest, and it's used for higher value products. So if you're fans of Apple, like some of you that have iPhones, you might have heard stories about Steve Jobs. So if you follow the Apple iPhone and MacBook releases, usually they do them late in the year. So for instance, the last event, you must remember, it was a couple of weeks ago. They do it in September, and then they release some other products in October, sometimes in November as well. So for some countries, when they need extra deliveries for Christmas, they tend to use air transport because the product is expensive enough that it pays for itself when they transport it. And that's something that Steve Jobs used to do. I'm not sure if they do it anymore. And obviously, when you have to get to a certain specific point, but you want to be cost efficient as well, you can use multimodal transport and combine different types of transport together. If you are sending things between Asia and the European Union, for example, rough estimates for the moment are for a plane delivery, and we've done some of these, it's usually 3 or 4 days, although it says 1 to 10. It's between 1 and 10, but 3 or 4 is the usual time that you get on that. If you're using the train, especially, there's the obviously the new Zhongwu Banlie that China is promoting. At the moment, it should be around 14 days, but some of them do come through slower. But perhaps that's in development still. If you're using sea transport, ocean-based deliveries, usually you wait for about a month, especially if it's a bulk order. That's usually your best option, and you're stuck with waiting for about a month. So, given that these are